All right, welcome back to another episode of Raise 'Em Up. It is great to be here. This is Pastor Lee. I don't think I ever really introduced myself every time. I don't know. I'll have to go back and listen to things. But I also have with me
Keith Gedeke
and
Melanie Schultz.
It is great to have you guys back here as we're talking through, continuing to walk through Sticky Faith. And it's been a refreshing journey for me so far, for sure, because it's just good reminders, good solid things. And really, I'm finding a lot of times that everything's a lot more simpler than we try and make it. You know, are you guys finding the same thing as you look through this?
Simplicity, yes. And I also love having the community, just knowing that you're not alone.
Yes. No, I think that's a good message, especially for parents to hear, because that's what we're about, right?
Yep.
Raise them up, about raising up kids in the faith. And especially, I like that you pointed out the community as we start, because when we dive into chapter 5, which is a sticky web of relationships, it's all about the community. And I think the community is important the entire way through. But it's especially important once your kid crosses that line from 6th to 7th grade, right? As you look into high school, that's one of the things I saw from the writers of this. So I'm curious, even before we dive into that, as you reflect and what you read, and as you hear that about the importance of community, you guys as parents, how have you found the importance of community in your own parenting experiences?
Oh, I love having a community of believers that are nearby that can support me in my faith, but that also have kids of a similar age, and that we can just kind of bounce ideas off of each other, commiserate, babysit. It's awesome to have that community.
That's awesome. And I thought of you guys, actually, you're like small group and grow group and things like that when I was reading certain pieces of this chapter. So that'll be fun to kind of dive in. Keith, how about you? Where have you seen that importance of community as you look back on your parenting?
Well, believe it or not, your children listen to other people besides you as their parents. I mean, it is just amazing that they would do that, but they do listen to other people. And the people that you put in their lives are going to influence them, good or bad. So as a parent, you've got to know they're going to have influences, and what you do with those influences is part of parenting.
Exactly. And I love this chapter for the sake that it gives us just really, and gives our parents like practical steps forward of how to do that, how to allow other adults and mentors and things like that. And really, I also really just appreciated the stories in this chapter in particular of seeing real life situations played out. Again, not always pretty, but certainly just that, what does a baby step look like and things like that. So let's just kind of start with where the chapter starts with, and that is this premise, this idea, this illustration of the kids' table versus the adult table, because I kind of laughed and smiled because that was exactly how Thanksgiving was at my mom's parents' house growing up. Thanksgiving was always at my mom's parents', and there was always the kids' table, and there was always the adults' table that had the fancy china and all this other stuff. And it really was a big deal when you could transition, and it was probably around high school, maybe 8th grade, that you could go and sit at an adult table, you know? But help our listeners kind of understand, why did they give us this illustration? What were they kind of trying to paint for us in that?
Well, for me, it's like if you treat a child like a child, he'll act like a child. And when you want him to become an adult, you start letting him act like an adult. There's just certain things in life, and, you know, we can jump ahead to 16 and driving a car, which is a very mature thing to do. But, you know, in this day and age, it could be something like a phone, it could be social media, but there's also rituals within your family, going to church, what you can do at church, what you wear, how you dress, how you act, what conversations you get to be a part of at the family table or, you know, in the living room or whatever, not asked to leave the room. But again, you're controlling that environment, and that's to me is where the kids' table talk comes in. It's not just eating, it's just every aspect of life.
Yeah, exactly. And so when you think about parenting your own children, your own kids, right? How am I raising an adult, right? I kind of tell parents this because I get the joy, right, of working with 7th to 12th graders here at Trinity. And so especially as I get those first 7th graders, I make it really, really clear to their parents, just so you know, you're no longer raising boys and girls. You're raising men and women, right? It's a huge transition to know. And the reality is, right, even younger than that, you're already starting to raise men and women. I mean, and that's something really, really important for parents to kind of keep in mind as you think about not just kind of as you said, think about the conversations you're having. Think about and I think this is cool because that was where we were last time. when they're talking about something, kind of ask why first. Like, where did you hear that? Why are you asking about that? And so get the background before you kind of dive into it, but meet them where they're at. Meet them exactly where they're at to have the conversations they want to have when they want to have them. And there was also, right, the convicting part for me, the kids' table versus the adult table when it comes to how churches operate. And so one of the big themes that kind of came out of this whole thing was the importance of intergenerational ministry and life together. So, and I love that partnership and that picture of the house and the home reflecting the church too. So the same thing we're talking about, have this conversation with your kids. How are the kids incorporated into our time together?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's wonderful. I remember some of the strongest memories of my home church growing up were things like I played in the handbell choir.
That's awesome.
And I was probably 30 years younger than most of the people, but I loved it. And I just thought it was the coolest thing to be included with the adults. And I think a lot of kids crave that, which is something that this chapter pointed out.
Exactly. And that's where I loved where it kind of started too. Like churches oftentimes find themselves in silos, okay, or in isolation. So kids go here, youth go here, adults go here. And it's something that I mean, I'm a pretty young pastor, right? 5 years in. And it's something that I've kind of find myself kind of meeting a wall against too, because we do think, oh, that's just so easy to do. We'll get the kids what they want and give the youth what they want, and adults, then we can have what we have. But there's a huge joy I've seen when those barriers are broken down and you bring everybody together and you help them to find a place. Like it's certainly been a convicting thing when we've worked through what do our students want or need. And one of the big conversations we had, I'll say recently, but because of the pandemic, that could mean 2 or 3 years ago, that recently we've kind of talked about how do we help our kids and our students find a place on Sunday mornings, like in worship? How do we engage them? It's been a conversation we've been having for a while, because I remember as a high schooler how cool it was when I didn't have to sit with my family anymore. Right? I could go sit with my friends. And I loved the opportunity that the pastor knew who we were and talked to us and things like that. So, and even in the sermons, being able to mention that, like I do my best to try and do that, because I kind of see my role as speaking for the people that I work really strongly with, the students and their parents and the kids and their parents. And so the more I can do that and have them have a spotlight, the better off we are, right? And it's just because the research kind of shows, and that's really where they were getting at too. And I loved how they pointed out that this is where Jesus challenged his disciples too, right? So we had Luke 9:47, this conversation of the least and the greatest. In the midst of this, Jesus brings before them a child, right? To say, welcome the little children. And they went into like the Greek of it and all this stuff of this idea of hospitality, of elevating everyone, not just people who are important. And I thought that was a really challenging and really convicting one when it came for us as a church. I mean, what is you guys experience either here or in past of that experience of that siloing and things like that? Where have you seen that play out?
Well, I mean, I grew up in, a long time ago, but part of it for me was always a worth ethic. It was kind of that thing of when you were asked to engage in certain types of activities. Like, for instance, I couldn't use a car until I learned how to change the oil. That was just one of the things that you had to do. Nowadays, nobody changes their oil, or very few people change their oil because with the service that is provided. And I think sometimes church can get that way too, that there's just things that just don't happen. Like COVID was a good example. We didn't have acolytes for a while, so that took out the youth participation and somewhat in church. But now that we've restarted that, and we have to be very intentional about that. There's just a lot of things that we take for granted sometimes, and once is a routine, twice is a routine, third time can be a rut. So we get so used to it, we don't realize the advantage of participation. But everybody likes to be spoken to. And sometimes even in the dialogue of church, is it directed toward young people? They may be, a pastor could reference things that a kid would never have read or never have seen. So things have to be relational.
Yeah, totally.
And that's where it is, just getting connectivity with something so that something sticks.
And this is meeting so many conversations that I have had over I want to say the year, but again, the pandemic is now spreading into, right? Because we're still in it, whether or not we want to admit it or not. But it's good, right? Because it's not just kids that want a piece of the service. It's everybody wants to be involved, wants to be a part of the service. You feel more valued when you're doing, and I love what this paints for us is that picture of community. Of it's not just, and every single one of us will tell you this, it's not just a pastor's job to make worship happen. You know, I learned that on Vicarage actually. I'll shout out, and it's true for here at Trinity Klein too. But it amazed me how many people it took to make a service happen when I was on Vicarage, because you had the volunteer that made the slides, you had the volunteer that ran the slides, you had the pastor who created the service, who put it into a thing, the secretary who printed the bulletins, the bulletin folders who came together to fold the bulletins, the ushers that came together to hand out the bulletins, the altar guild that got the communion ready, or the make sure the candles were filled, or even sometimes took care of the pastoral robes and things like that to make sure they were good. Now add to it the music, and especially if there is special music or in the contemporary one, how many different practices they needed in order to be ready. I mean, it was just incredible to me, every layer. And then add to it after the service what needs to happen, and things need to be cleaned up, and things need to be turned off, and things like that. It is a picture of community, and I just value that so much.
And make sure the temperature's the right temperature.
Exactly, especially in Green Bay where I was. That's
Right.
it's funny, like, oh, that's a whole nother conversation, but the conversation of where they put the heaters in that room when they designed the
Right.
building were miserable for Green Bay. Over here we were like, heaters, why do you need a heater? But yeah. So, and as we think about that community, I think the other big theme, at least that stood out for me, is this ratio. I mean, that's something we definitely need to tackle, and I have the same ratio, right? When it comes to student ministry trips, we're 1-to-5 ratio, one adult for every 5 students. But they want us to flip that, and we've known this. Again, this book's about 10, 11, 12 years old. They want you to flip that ratio when you think about your student, and this is, I think, what's going to be helpful to parents that are listening, because we kind of dabbled into the church conversation, but really truly this is a podcast about equipping parents to raise up students in the faith. And this is what it's saying to you guys. Think about 5 adults that can have an influence on your one child, right? Where did that strike you? What things stood out to you about this new ratio? And what would you want parents to know, kind of having dove into this chapter?
Well, I like what Keith said at the very beginning. He said that your kids are going to be influenced by people anyway, and they're going to be people other than you. So if you can have a hand in helping your child identify positive adults and then invite them into relationship with your child, I think that just has an immense potential for lifelong impact. And I like that they said, you don't have to hide this from your kids. You can be really intentional. You can ask them, who are 5 people that you admire, or who's just one person that that you would like to spend time with, that you think would be fun to hang out with. And you could just start with one and invite that person into your world, tell them what you're doing, and really just get the ball rolling that way. So 5-to-1 struck me as a little bit intimidating at first. Like if I'm feeling like I'm on an island as a parent to try and wrangle 5 adults and then try and figure out how to get them into my world, that did sound a little intimidating. But I loved that they said, talk to your kid about it and start small, right? The sticky web of relationships, the picture that stuck out to me was the spider having to put those anchor points of the web. And that's what we're doing for our kids, is we're placing these anchor points for them to have, so that as they build their life with all its different experiences, those anchor points can hold them in place and they can visit anybody that they need to. But it's more than just us, because frankly, they're not always going to listen to our opinions.
Yeah, no, exactly. Especially again, that adolescence through the high school. And I want to touch on so many things you just talked about, because I think they're so wonderful, but really bringing home that they're not going to listen to you. Who was the coach that was referenced in the...
It was
Tony
like a
Dungy.
football coach.
Tony Dungy.
Yeah.
Indianapolis Colts, great coach and things like that. And his high school son, this is a story from the book. His high school son, his dad, well-respected NFL head coach,
Yep.
was telling him, hey, you need to eat breakfast. You need
A good breakfast,
a good
yeah.
breakfast, right? And his son wasn't doing it. His son wasn't listening to, again,
Yep.
a really well-respected NFL coach. And then one day, his son got up and he was cooking this really big breakfast for himself. And he's like, oh, yeah, he's finally listening to my advice. And he said, hey, I see you're making yourself a really good breakfast. He said, yeah, coach told me I needed to do that. I just laughed reading that, because parents, and I'm sure you feel that way, because I would imagine that a parent feels so defeated when my kid isn't listening to me, when it's
Yeah.
in one ear and out the other.
Yep.
But I think that's true in general in leadership sometimes too. And more that you lead, the joy is when they finally do it and they don't realize that they're doing what you said, right? They don't realize that they're following your advice, but they start sounding like you in the things that they say. And they are listening, one.
Yes.
But two, that's the importance of bringing other adults into their lives, and people that not just they respect and want to be like, but that you respect too, and that you have a relationship. And I love some of the words you're using that were words in the chapter, and that's being intentional. So being intentional about it. And I think that's a starting step for our parents that are listening right now too, is just taking these little baby steps. So what are some of the baby steps? Because there are so many cool stories, once again, that you saw, and being intentional and how to go about it, and what do I do once we identify and things like that. What are some of the ideas you really appreciated from this chapter?
Well, I mean, part of me is thinking about, you just encourage people to be a part of your children's lives. I mean, sometimes that has to be very intentional. I mean, you have to make sure that if they have aunts or uncles or grandparents or family members or whatever, they get to see them, and that's part of their life, or good friends or people who have done certain things that they actually talk to a pastor. I don't think I had a conversation with a pastor until I was in confirmation. And then he came in and started teaching. It was like, wow, he's talking to me, because all those other years he was just talking.
Sure, yeah.
And that was for adults. That was big people church. And then, he with the flowing white robe, and his name was Pastor BR here at Trinity. And I mean, I thought he walked back there and sat with God on that big wooden throne chair they had up there, and it's like,
That's
wow.
so
and
funny.
then when Pastor Belts came in, it was the same thing, and he was this guy. But then, wow, one day he came into the classroom, and he intentionally talked to us about our faith and my faith. What do you mean, my faith? I'm just told to believe, so I believe. Actually, he's got the ball rolling of me thinking about, am I really doing anything other than rote memory? Am I doing anything but just reciting liturgy? I mean, we sang the Te Deum every Wednesday, and I mean, I didn't know what it meant.
I say you talked about that. You and Lyle would have sang that together, right?
Yeah. And me, for me, I didn't know it, and it was too fast. So to be the Lord everlasting. I knew all the last words because I couldn't keep up.
Right,
But again, it was just something we did. And then actually to read it and start being contemplative of it was a life changer for me. And, then of course that was the beginning of contemporary music too, back in the 70s probably, when I was there, and we sang Pass It On and Turn by the Byrds, and that was like, oh my gosh, that's from
Turn. Yeah.
Well, that's from Ecclesiastes.
Yeah.
I mean, one of our
no kidding.
one of our young,
now I do know it. Okay,
yeah, one of our young cool teachers said, well, this is biblical. It's like, wow, rock and roll is biblical, man. And all of a sudden it was like, hey, this stuff is pretty cool. It's not thee and thou and begat and all those words that, again, didn't make sense to me. And we had the Good News for Modern Man Bible, which mine had a blue jean cover on it. And I thought, that was just so hip.
Yeah,
because it wasn't that big stodgy 70s Bible that that everybody else carried. I had my own. Good News for Modern Man was the name of it, and had little drawings in it and cool, like stick figure people. But again, it was more intended for me. And hey, yeah, God is for me, not something that I'm looking at, but something that I'm involved in.
And I think that's so convicting for me as a church worker, like hearing that, because again, I think like the same way parents will sit there and question, right? Am I really doing enough? Am I really being heard? All this other stuff. We all do it, right? We all ask it. I mean, the same thing's true for me. Like, am I really impactful? Are they really listening to me, right? When you preach, when you talk to kids, things like that. But really, that's not, again, this is what this book is challenging us to do. But the conversation we're having too is it's just about relationships. Do you know names? Do you know lives? Are you doing community and life together?
Yeah.
There's that reality. And so while I also heard that for the church, right, that's a challenge, I can speak from experience too. I so appreciate when parents invite me in very intentional ways. So I think of a family that I went to football games for their son, and I think when their daughter got old enough, right? The volleyball games I couldn't make because of COVID restrictions, but like we were intentional about having that conversation. So even when you think of those adults in your life, think of very intentional opportunities for them to come and join. I have another family who the kids are very involved in marching band or student council. And so every year I go to at least one football game with them too. So it's just very intentional to be able to do that. And then especially to be able to go and talk to that student where I'm there,
Yeah.
or to meet their grandparents that are coming with them too. You know, there's a level of that life together that really helps whoever those 5 are to be with it. And the whole coming over, that's one of those same families. I wonder if they read Sticky Faith. Would it have me over to dinner? And hey, we need to have you over to dinner, you know, things like that, to be there with the kids and to meet the kids and to see it in a different setting. Like really, really cool stuff that's really intentional. And this goes for, and again, I'm not saying do this for pastors. I'm saying do this for your kids 5.
Right.
Like, who are your kids' people? Are you inviting them into their life? Are you saying, I get this often too. My kid has a play. You know, like, hey, here's the weekend. Are you able to make it? You know,
Yeah.
and that's just so helpful to be intentional for your child, to just invite you to stuff you're already doing. You don't necessarily have to create something else for your kid to be able to interact with, but just invite them to what's already happening. Yeah. Other things that kind of stood out for me as I was reading through this. I mean, there was the opportunity to pray for those people that you're identifying as the 5, that thanking God that they care about Melanie, right? if Melanie was your child's name, right? To pray for them, to talk about them. I loved the picture of I think I pulled maybe I'm thinking this wrong, but it sounded like it was a single mom, and she really needed for her son to have male role models. So for
Yes.
her 5, she took a picture of her son with those male role models and hung them on the wall. And there were also blank frames as a reminder of, we're not done forming those kind of relationships with mentors and things like that. I thought that was so cool and such a really cool, interesting, and to some extent easy, simple idea to be doing this.
And I like that they did talk about how you can and should use your family, but it goes beyond that too.
Yes.
So if you're in a mindset like, oh, well, they have their aunts and uncles or they have their grandparents, that's great, that's good. But your student will desire even more outside resources. They will want to step outside that family, because we all do. We all did. And so just to think about, who is it? Is it a coach that they already have? Is it a teacher that they loved? Is it, a Sunday school teacher? Maybe it's their best friend's parent that you have a relationship with.
Exactly.
And if you can even just have even if you don't totally know how deep they are in their faith, have that conversation with them. Hey, my child admires you, and I would love for you to step into a mentor role with my child. And
Good.
here's what I'm looking for. How do you feel about that? And really give them the information that they need so that they can step up to the plate and be there for your child in the way that you want them to be.
And I love that as a transition, right? Because this parent may be listening, that's great. No, I'm going to do that. And then they would stop listening and then go home and be like, oh, what information do they need, right? And this chapter even covers that.
Yep.
Like, that's the really cool thing. So, because I want you parents to be listening and hear this in this way, right? 1, what would you say to someone else who might be a mentor for your child or a trusted adult? That's a phrase I really like.
Yeah.
And then 2, you might be that mentor or trusted adult for someone
Yes,
else. Okay.
absolutely.
So what do you need to hear? What do you need to think of when someone else's kid? Because that whole takes a village to raise a child. And I really enjoy my experience at Trinity Klein. And I do think we could do a better job of opening doors for more people to do this. But I've really seen the village walk alongside of so many classes as they're intentional for that. But probably the biggest question I liked that it started with was being able to have the mentor ask the question, what is God already doing? So it goes back to the Sticky Faith conversations that we had.
Yeah.
What's going well? What's not going well? What's God teaching you right now? Where are you seeing God at work? What's God already doing in your life? Bringing God into the conversation is a really important thing. I absolutely loved, I can never say his name, the Canadian pastor leader, Carrie Nieuwenhof, I believe is how you say it. And his whole thing with his 5 for his teenage boy when he turned 13 was the invitation was for him to shadow these 5 men for a certain period of time, right? For a day, it was kind of it, but for one, it was 2 hours, for one, it was a full day, or just spend a day with each of them.
Yeah.
And one of them went camping, like one of them, things like that.
Yeah.
And the only thing that Carrie asked of these men was at some point share a spiritual lesson or a spiritual truth from your life and a life truth or a life lesson. That's simple.
That's it.
You know,
Yep.
as a mentor, one day a year. I mean, that was it. One day a year, spending time with this person intentionally. It could be a lunch. Like you could say, "Hey, would you take my son out to lunch? I'll pay for it. Just I would love for you to have that conversation with him." What an easy thing to do, you know. And in the grand scheme of things, again, not something difficult. And say, and as you're there, would you just share with them a spiritual truth and a life truth from your life? That would
Yeah.
just be so impactful for him to hear that. And then the next time that they see them, like there's a very special relationship that's built with that person, right? So, and I think that's what's so cool about this
Yeah.
is it really is those simple steps that have profound and lasting impacts all the rest of the way. And Carrie, he at some point after that had, I think it was for his 13th birthday or something. I didn't get the clear picture there, but he brought all 5 of the men together for a barbecue to celebrate this significant milestone and birthday. And with his son, they had partnered and given each man a gift. And I think it was a Bible with their names on it. And he asked each of them, or he had kept a journal of what he learned from the men. The student did, the kid did, and shared with them what he took away from each of the encounters. And then all 5 of the men prayed over him in that moment. That was powerful. Now, granted, again, Carrie's a pastor, he was creative, but hey, borrow it, take
Borrow
it,
it, steal.
go.
Yep.
Yeah.
Go for it.
I mean,
There's one thing that I thought was really cool. My husband did this for me one time. I was going through a patch of time when I was kind of scared, and he reached out to my sisters and my mom and asked them to send me a little message, just a comforting message. I think, well, how could you translate that for your kid? Could you reach out and just say, hey, would you take a video of a prayer for my kid so that I can show them? Because even if they live far away, right? Even if you don't get to see these relatives or these adults in your child's life very often, that's something easy that they can do that will be a lasting piece. That's a spiritual testimony to the fact that they care about your child and they are entrusting your child to God. And they're speaking life-giving truth over your child, and they've got that video that they can look back on anytime. So yeah, it's something as easy as, can you record just a prayer or a video of encouragement, or words of wisdom, and send that on in, and then I can give that to my child as a gift. How cool.
yeah, and that's where I appreciated things like milestones of allowing these 5 or these mentors, whoever trusted adults. It doesn't have to be 5. It could be 10, it could be 12, whatever you want.
Yeah.
To even, like, I like how it said, like, text, I think it was back in the day of Skype, right? Zoom, or mailing something.
Yeah.
Or providing opportunities, again, for significant milestones or birthdays, of having the same card or something, giving it to these mentors and saying, would you write
Yep.
something to my child for this occasion? You know, like that kind of intentionality and planning is so good. And the other one that I love for mentors is the piece of advice, again, for you, if you're going to take that role for somebody else, or if you're going to talk to someone, say you go out to lunch or spend that day or spend whatever time. The other cool thing is just to say, hey, will you just ask them if they have any questions about anything?
Yeah.
Will you let them have that kind of free space? You know, because a lot of times students have to learn, kids. I'm sorry, I get in that role. I'm not a parent, so I get in that student's role, but kids have to learn it's okay to ask questions and things like that. That's part of the sticky faith conversations again. But to have another place where they can ask questions and allow it to be safety. Allow it to be as long as the kid's safe, right? Which I always say is meaning that they're not going to harm themselves or someone else. Allow them that halo, that whatever is said and talked about does not have to be relayed back to me.
Right.
You have that level of safety with things. And so, and then if a bigger conversation needs to happen, by all means, have a bigger conversation, bring a pastor in, bring the family in, find that kind of mediation and things like that. I mean, but I just think it's so important to be a place where the questions can be asked. And it's important for a mentor to hear this too. The kid's not going to be judged for asking the question. The kid's not going to be berated or lectured or anything like that, but just talk to you. Like, tell me more. Tell me about that. Why do you want to know? Like, those are important follow-up questions once a kid does answer a question. Had a really cool experience at a retreat. So I had a kid, 7th grader. We just talked about God, all this stuff, and it was about how God feeds us and he's with us and things like that. And they came up to me and they were so terrified. Like, you could tell in their eyes, they didn't want to, but they knew they wanted to ask the question. And they said, I hear what you're saying, but what if God doesn't exist? To which, especially after reading this book, I was like, I am so ready to go.
Yeah.
I was like, isn't that a great question?
Yeah.
And they were so surprised that I would
Yeah.
say something like that. I was like, every single one of us has been challenged by that question at some point. I know when I wrestle with that question, when that doubt starts sneaking in my mind, when Satan tries to place it there, this is where I go and this is what I do. Is that helpful at all for you? Does that? And it was a different conversation than, well, God is real and you shouldn't, that's a doubt, that's a question, that's a totally different conversation. So mentors allow that kind of grace to come into the space.
I'm so glad that you said that. You talked about it from a question perspective and giving a free space for the student. I say it too.
There you go.
For the child to talk and to express themselves. And Keith harkened back to this early. When the pastor came to you and said, what do you think about this? And tell me about your faith. And giving them that ownership. And allowing them to kind of practice and test the waters with what do I believe and what do I think, and bouncing those ideas off of somebody is so important. So yes, make it very clear to your mentors that they're not there to be a pastor and preach, right? They're not there to be they don't have to be a theology teacher and lecture the student, but just to kind of say, well, tell me about where you're at, and then let me share a little bit about where I'm at or what I've gone through. And let me point you to some things that have helped me as an adult. I think that's a really good framework for a mentor.
Absolutely. And Keith, I want to bring you in here too, because one of the other things that stood out to me was it talked about how important the intergenerational piece was. So as these parents think about their kids 5, I think the cool thing, because we talked about as a church, and there's so many lessons I'm taking away for us as a church and as a family of God here at Trinity, but certainly the importance of intergenerational folks speaking into your kid's life. I'm reminded, for instance, of the Veterans Day Chapel and how impactful that is to see these men who have served for so long and the impact these kids get to have when they listen to their stories and get to sit there and things like that. So, but I loved how this pointed out the two often overlooked groups in churches are kids and
the elderly.
Exactly.
Oh.
And so how important both are. And so a lot of times from my perspective, both it seems like older people are somewhat afraid, but I love it when the intentionality is there on behalf of parents or on behalf of ministry leaders. It is some of the coolest experiences ever. So where have you seen that play out, or what do you hope parents know as they think about their 5 and think about not just parents of other kids, because everybody's busy, but bringing back in kind of these pseudo grandparents or pseudo great uncles or whatever you want to call them?
Well, I mean, I think it's something that, again, you got to be very deliberate about, and you got to make sure that they have opportunity without it being forced. It's kind of a, like when students can help, and like you mentioned Veterans Day. Well, the first thing our kids do here is they serve them a breakfast. So they're just bringing them coffee and a donut, and then hey, they're real people, and they're not they're strangers, but they're not strange. And of course, you talk about veterans, and they know that what their purpose is. But there's so, I think that's reflective in everything we do. We might say, hey, this person's a mentor, you can learn from them. But do you also then sometimes tell other things about people that, well, why would I listen to them? There's always that thing about why, because as uplifting as we can be, we can also be very deflating.
Sure, sure.
And, there's another group in there too, like I had a mentor as a child, and he was the first person in my family he was my mother's brother, my uncle, and he was the first to go to college. And it was always like, he went to college, and he was in the armed forces, and he was this, and he was very social. Nobody wanted to ride to church with him because he would always stay after and talk to everybody. And everybody you ever talked to that knew him was, oh, he was a great guy. He was this, he was this. He was Mr. Klein High School and all this mess. I never even met him. He died 2 years before I was born.
Oh, wow.
But I didn't realize till I was later how much that positive talk about him shaped my life. Because everybody that ever met him said, yeah, you would have loved your Uncle Hank. He was a great guy. He was a great guy. Well, that's mentorship, even though he didn't personally mentor. It's just the attitude and the way that we talk. If you have a problem with your brother or sister and your children hear you ripping on their aunt and uncle, then you go to Thanksgiving, Well, what do you think your kid's going to do?
That's true.
Yeah,
That's
good point.
super true.
And there's probably people that could tell stories like, yeah, he told on me one time and said, and we got to let people grow up. And I've seen that with older people. Sometimes they don't let their siblings grow up. They reminded them what they did when they were 8 years old. Well, let your kid grow up. But they will make their own decisions. And again, you just give them opportunity to be reflective. And the thing I always remember is I'm a moon, not a sun. I don't give off light, I reflect it.
Oh, I love that.
And if you reflect good light to your children and give them chances to see other people who reflect good light, they'll shine it back. But again, sometimes there's an eclipse on that kind of stuff, and we don't quite do it that way. But put them around good people and let them make their own decisions. And got to make sure they have filters too, because I've had some, and we won't go into those, but I've had some embarrassing conversations with people, and like, okay, we don't need to tell them what you did when you were a kid that you got in trouble for, because don't give them ideas. But again, that makes them real and it's fun. And I mean, in today, I think we change so much. You take someone my age, 60 or older. We didn't grow up with so many things that students have today, so it's kind of hard to. I mean, kids just look at you funny when you say, my life was so miserable, I had to get off the couch and turn the channel of the 3 TV stations that I could get. And they're like, what? Like you had to get up? There was only 3 TV stations? And I mean, there's hundreds of examples of that. But
I think maybe another piece of that, especially as we're talking about sticky web of relationships, is the way that the family unit has changed and treated its children, just even in the last 50, 60 years.
Oh, sure.
I mean, you think about multi-generational families living together versus now we're very separated. And the role of children has shifted as well. Like now we let them do children things all the time, and they have their children things and we have our adult things, where I don't think the family unit functioned that way until much more recently. I think it was, we do things as a family and everybody has their jobs on the farm or at the store or different things like that. And so the fact that we are kind of conditioned to shove kids into a corner and kind of keep them from the conversations, or we only go visit grandma or great grandma once or twice a year for 30 minutes, I think we miss some of those opportunities to do things as a family, to do things with the older generation. There's a show in Australia, and it's like the elderly with preschoolers. I can't remember what it's called, but it's like this social experiment. And they put 4-year-olds with these elderly patients at nursing homes. And it's the coolest thing. Like, it just makes you want to cry tears of joy, how beautiful their relationships are, how innocent, and how much they bless each other. And I think, we get scared about about mixing generations, or we just don't know how to do it. Just try it. Just do it. Just make those opportunities happen. And I think you'd be surprised.
Those folks listening can't see the smile on my face, but like, that's so fun. Like, I would watch
So
that.
cool.
Totally. I'm going to have to figure out the name of that show.
I was trying to look it up for you. But
Okay. Yeah. Because and that's what I've learned. I had this conversation recently too. I mean, we were watching kids playing and here's where we've gotten to. It's not just older folks that have that fear about kids. It's their parents. Like, we're to that point. I remember it. It was in the fall. It was the football. We had our football team gathering, and we were struggling to get volunteers for our retreat. And I was kind of reflecting honestly with some parents that I was closer with, and they were like, "Yeah, we don't even feel like we connect." And it's like, and I think it's a giant lie, right? I mean, not an intentional lie.
Right.
I'm saying it's a lie we're hearing from the devil, right? I point it out all the time because he's been really, really good at isolating us, especially in this 2020, 2021 time frame. That is just isolating us, trying to say we're not good enough, we don't get it, and things like that. I said, look, like, I looked out, they were all playing football at the field. I said, you take the phones out of their hands and look what they do. The same thing that you did as a kid. They run around, they throw the ball, they play together, they talk together, so there are certainly, respect the differences by all means,
Sure.
but at the end of the day, they're still people, they're still little humans, and that opportunity to walk alongside of it. And I remember as a kid, and so I guess, I was born in '89, so I grew up in the '90s and on into the early 2000s when the cell phone became a thing. And so everybody already thought, I had to grow up and learning what a computer was because we didn't really know that, and the internet, like, and all that stuff. But I'm sure the old people felt the same way about me. Like, I was growing up in a world that they weren't familiar with. But y'all, I was fascinated with the older people in my life. I really was. And again, now when I hear about their funerals and things like that, it still impacts me because they were such an influence. They cared about me when they didn't have to. When I came to church, they would ask me how things were going, especially as I grew up and as I was going through college and they knew I was going to be a pastor too. They were very, very excited for my path forward. And I've seen the same thing happen here at Trinity, is that is so encouraging for our students when they're able to come back in the summers or as they're here, right? Some of them are local here. And the cool relationships that are built from just learning where their life is going and walking alongside of it. And we have so much to learn from those that have gone before us, and I think even our kids today somewhere will get that, right? Maybe they don't get it right away, but they will get that we have so much to learn and so much to share. I think that's the better word, because as I use the word learn and teach, it turns into this lecture
hierarchy kind of thing.
Yeah. And this lecture, get it right, things like that. But we have so much to share together. And especially when it comes to elderly and youth, or elderly and kids. And I love the pictures that we got and the stories of the older Sunday school teachers with kids, because we have that here too, of how much joy people get in that kind of interaction. And those relationships last. When you take the time to see somebody, know their name, know their story, there's a connection built that you just can't beat. Yeah. One thing I'll point you to, if you don't have the book, I'll just look at it. Page 117, there was that question that I'm sure a number of parents are asking themselves as they're listening to this, was basically about not going to, am I on the right? My kid doesn't want to, right? That was kind of the phrase in there. So what are some things that you can do, whether it's church, right? Because it was really cool up front. It kind of mentioned just going to corporate worship, which means church all together, and being in the presence of older people and younger people. That was a huge indicator of sticky faith. Again, there was no silver bullet, and taking your kid to church is not going to guarantee that they have faith that sticks, but that was a huge indicator. There's a giant correlation there to be around them. So you might be saying, well, what if I'm in that boat that my kid doesn't want to go? And here was just some of the pieces of advice that we'll give to you guys from the book. It says, make sure your kids know that as important as church is to you as a parent, you respect their desire not to go. At the same time, let them know that being a part of God's family is an important part of your family's life. And this will connect to the next chapter too, and that it's about your identity as a family. So there's a level of, this is who we are. We go to church. I'm going to respect you, but I want you to know that, right? And then there's a level of honoring them that's going to be strange to them, I think. Number 2, find ways to connect your child to Christian friends in casual or organic settings. As these intentional relationships develop and deepen, your child will have a greater internal incentive to get involved. So this, I think, definitely goes to the 5 to 1. Like, who are your 5? Who are your friends? Who are you bringing over? And are you making sure, like similar to the sticky faith conversations, you're getting caught talking about God and having faith conversations and talking about needing to trust God with this or this or this. Number 3, find out what, if any, faith activities they would like to go or are willing to be a part of. And she said, I would do all you can to steer away from making them go. Perhaps this is a parachurch group, which means a group outside of a congregation, or a different church's worship service or a Bible study would help them feel more connected and involved. Sometimes a fringe church or youth group will become a place where they can connect with a faith community. So again, and you're hearing that from the guy that runs student ministry. I'm not envious. I'm not jealous over any of them. The only one I'm jealous of making sure we get him back from is Satan himself. So like, by all means, if they're finding a home somewhere else, let's rejoice and praise God for that. Number 4, and the final one, in the end, do your best to seek a compromise. Depending on their age and your family's circumstance, ask your child to attend with you once a month, especially if they're plugged in somewhere else, and to do it out of love and respect for you and your faith. If they're attending a different church, you should probably offer to attend that church with them monthly also. I thought that was just such great advice, because I'm sure there are some parents listening out there that say, it's not us. I can't even get him to go to church. And so I wanted to make sure that we got to share in that too.
Well, I would add a number 5 on there too. Make sure that your reflections are positive. I mean, so often after church, we give a criticism like, oh, that was too long. Or do we have to sing every verse? Or Pastor got on, And if they're hearing that, well, why would I want to go? Fair. Why would I want to go? Especially if they don't go and you come home and you don't say something that, what? That's not inviting. Oh, y'all sing how many? Oh, yeah, that's too much, too much. I mean, again, it's all you. It starts with you.
That's so good. It goes back to
Yep.
your moon and sun conversation. You're not the sun, you're the moon. You're reflecting. What are you reflecting,
Yeah.
though, moon?
Yeah.
Are you reflecting darkness?
Yeah.
Are you reflecting light?
Right. And, it's like anything. If somebody doesn't have friends, I think you have to say, well, first it starts with you. What are you doing that's friendly to attract friends, or what are you doing? And again, if you're not talking positive or pointing out the positives, then the negatives get a lot too much attention.
Oh, yeah. And they consume you, right?
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
and that's where it's like, there's a lot of times, and it's funny because I recently got called an optimist, and I was like, no, I'm not. like I really did laugh when I heard that. I'm a realist, but I'm also, I think what helps me is I remember what my anchor is, and my anchor is the Word of God. And what I find there is be an encourager, speak truth with grace, and that's the thing is like I hold tightly to what I know to be true and who I'm called to be, and I'm called to love God and love my neighbor, right? And so that conversation and modeling that positivity, if you will, is so crucial to what it means to follow Jesus. Like, even I rejoice in all circumstances, right? Not just some, not just when I'm happy, not just when life is going well, but I rejoice and I find the good. I seek to find the good in everything that I'm about, because your kid is going to look like you. Like, I think that's been a refrain throughout our whole time too. Your kid will be a mini you. There's no question about it. No matter how much you send them
Good or
somewhere else.
bad.
Exactly.
Good or bad.
So any final thoughts then as we kind of wrap this up? Again, the things standing out to me, right? The kids table and the adult table. Like, how are you allowing that mix up both in your personal life, but then also, right? Maybe you're sitting there and you're passionate and at some point you want to make a difference in your church setting too. Again, whether that's, I would imagine this podcast is being listened to by people that don't go to Trinity or not even close to Trinity too, right? So wherever you're planted, wherever God has you, maybe God's planting a seed in you. That's the Holy Spirit working, saying this needs to happen. And maybe it's now, maybe it's down the road, but whatever it is, it's in the back of your mind. That 5-to-1, right? I think that's the biggest takeaway I have for parents is be intentional about your 5-to-1. Ask us questions. Seriously, send them in. Let's send us an email, post it on the Facebook, whatever it is. Like, ask us questions. Let's be in community and have conversations about what that looks like. And then finally, that huge piece for me is that intergenerational side. Don't forget the impact of elderly, empty nesters, and things like that, because they've been through it. For you too, right? As a parent, they have parented. And even if you just need somebody to listen, and you can say that, right? You can state what you need. I just need someone to listen. I don't need someone to fix right now. I just need someone to listen and reflect with me right now. And then by all means, if you're an older person who's listening to this right now, always, may I speak into that?
Yeah.
Was that okay if I do that? Ask that permission, like dance along those boundaries. Anything else that kind of stands out to you guys as you're reflecting back on this chapter?
I think focusing in on your child and where they are, it was a really big piece too. What are they interested in? What are their questions? Who are the people that they appreciate? Like, especially, giving your child some choice over where, the worship that they attend, or maybe if they've got some specific questions, hook them up with that pastor, set up a meeting, let them talk.
Exactly. I love the where they're plugged in. I totally forgot that in the chapter. That's why I was like, oh yeah. So like when you're thinking of your 5 and you're like, I don't even know where to start.
Yeah.
Well, I loved the gardening. Do you remember the gardening example? The mom's like, it was a situation where she's like, well, I hate gardening, but my daughter loves gardening. So what did she do? She knew an older couple or an older lady in the congregation that loved gardening. So she said, hey, well, can I give you some money and you go and buy garden bulbs and plant them at our house once a year?
Yeah.
Once a year, that was it. Like, what is your kid already interested in? What are the natural paths?
Yeah.
Like, God is molding them into a unique individual that will just so happen to look like you, but they might have unique interests that aren't your interest, and start there. Sorry, I wanted to go on that because I totally forgot. Keith, any other reflections you got taken away from this?
Well, if you don't know how or who to be a mentor, just practice being one yourself. And that you can identify a good mentor by being a good mentor. And if you have something like, let's just say it's family and you're together and it's like that person always asks embarrassing questions to my kid and puts them ill at ease. Well, do you do the same? Show them this is how you converse with someone to make them feel comfortable, and do that with your nieces and nephews. And maybe then people can learn, hey, yeah, that's right. But again, being a good mentor can help you identify good mentors. But of course, you're never going to just leave it to everybody else. But it's important, I think, to mirror that and be a good mentor to other people, whether you want to or not, or whether you're one of the 5 or not. Everybody you go, you influence in some way, shape, or form. So
Exactly. I always go back to my first year here. We talked about what a leader is, and a leader is someone who influences someone else's behavior, and that's all of us, right?
yeah,
And so if you say a joke and somebody laughs, you've just led by telling a joke, and even if they don't laugh and they groan, you've still influenced their behavior, right? So every single one of us has that opportunity, and hey. No, we know it's not going to go perfect every single time because we are also human beings who have lives that don't go perfect all the time or ever, I would say. But that's the thing but we're here together and you're not alone and we're here for you too. So again, I mentioned it before, but Raise Them Up at trinitycline.org and then the Raise Them Up podcast on Facebook. Definitely let us know your questions that you have, and we would love to be able to maybe do a Q&A at some point once we really get going into the series and things like that. That would be fun to kind of return to this. But yeah, next time we'll be with chapter 6, and that is about sticky justice. All right,
Love
sticky justice. I was going to say, I knew Melanie would love that one. So we're excited for that, and thank you guys so much for listening.